Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. Joining us, as always, is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, one data point for you all today, but first, a reminder or a bit of news for those who were not listening last week. We mentioned that we are making a call for donations from our listeners. We did this once earlier this year, doing so again. As we mentioned, we love making this podcast. We love that it's free, and we don't want to put it behind a paywall. So if you enjoy the podcast, please do consider making a donation. You'd find the link to do so in our show notes or on our website. You can look that up. It's pretty easy. Doesn't take long. Do consider it. We'd be grateful. Thanksgiving obviously is coming up, so do think about that. But as I mentioned, we do have that data point, and that is $61 billion. That is the amount of money that Ukraine requires to balance its books in 2026 and 2027. Russia and Ukraine are both squarely in the news right now, most recently in the day before we're recording this with Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's negotiator for all matters, having produced the outlines of a new proposed peace deal, though most reporting indicates it would be a non-starter for Ukraine. Other headlines on Ukraine and Russia, meanwhile, are more squarely economic. We have the United States sanctions on two Russian oil companies having gone into effect recently. The United States Congress considering a new package of sanctions that could pass this year. Ukraine, of course, is facing that budget shortfall I mentioned. And most acutely, there's a growing corruption scandal threatening to engulf the presidency of Zelensky in Ukraine. A lot of economic angles to consider in this geopolitical struggle right now. And so, we thought we'd take a closer look. And to start off with, Adam, those sanctions I mentioned that the United States has already put into effect on Russia, are those already working? Could we say? I mean, it seems like oil revenues are already down for Russia. And so, should we attribute this to United States sanctions taking an effect?
Yeah, I mean, so hitting Rosneft and Lukoil and their associated subsidiaries is a big deal. The Americans hadn't done anything quite like this before, and certainly Trump hadn't done anything quite like this before. So it's a big step. Trump's treasury is never shy about trumpeting its own achievements, so they certainly think and are announcing that they are having their intended effect in dampening Russian revenue by lowering the price of Russian oil and therefore the country's ability to fund its war effort against Ukraine. It certainly is making life a lot harder for the Russians. And the sanctions don't really bite until, I believe, the 21st of November. And so that will be probably the day of the release of this podcast. So we'll have to see over the coming weeks how the big players move. And the big players in this context are India and China, who are the big customers for Russian oil at the current moment. The oil market globally, one has to understand, is not like gas, right, which goes through a pipeline, one supplier to one consumer. Oil basically flows into a great big global, largely mobile, sea-mobile pool of oil. And some of it has little earmarks on it, like Russian, maybe don't touch this. But of course, if you don't touch it, somebody else will get it at a slight discount. Those discounts have been present in the market. They haven't been huge of late. Certainly over the summer, the discount had shrunk a long way down because the overall price of oil had come down. And in that kind of context, the gap between what the Russians were able to get and what other people were able to get had actually shrunk, surprisingly. Whereas at the peak, early on in the war, the overall price was higher. The Russians were getting better prices, but the margin was larger, so they were hurting more after the original price caps were introduced in 22. So I would say the jury is out. But this is definitely a step towards a much more radical regime of sanctioning. And the real question will be, and this is anyone's guess with the Trump administration, how they will play these things, whether or not they really intend to prosecute the secondary sanctions push. So in other words, to hurt the Indians if the Indians go on consuming this oil. Because we did an episode maybe a couple of months ago now where I was expostulating about the incoherence of American policy towards India, because the assumption in the wider world had always been the whole point was to sanction Russia whilst providing the Indians with a benefit, because the whole plan of American policy is to woo India away out of its independence, out of its non-alignment towards the Western Bloc. And so therefore a deal that hurt the Russians and benefited India was in the logic of American policy. The Trump administration appears at sometimes not to agree with this. We're going to see, I think, in weeks to come how this is played out. What is going on in the background, and it's quite robust and quite clear at this point, is that both India and China are building payments infrastructure, which means that they have tear away, throw away, sacrifice banks, if you like, that will engage in trade with Russia, which if they were to be sanctioned by the US, it wouldn't do systemic damage to their financial systems, and in where the payments are overwhelmingly organized in non-dollar currencies, so in rupee or renminbi. And that will limit the ability of America to actually do serious damage to anyone infringing these sanctions. But we're really going to see. This is very much up in the air. One of the reasons, I think, for wanting to do this episode today is that the economic war between Russia and Ukraine and the wider balance is in flux in the moment.
Yeah, and that's why I suppose I wanted to ask about taking a more holistic view of the Russian economy. I mean, as you mentioned, the strategy from the United States, maybe from the West more generally, is to weigh on Russia to change its own war strategy by strangling its economy or punishing its economy, one could say. So what would we say the greatest constraints on the Russian economy are right now? Are they fiscal constraints in the sense of oil revenues potentially falling and that complicating the Russian government's calculations? Or are they demographic, say? I mean, obviously, Russia is suffering war casualties. So how is that affecting the Russian economy? I mean, yeah, what would we say overall about the constraints and the health of the Russian economy right now?
Yeah, I think to feel the force of this question, it's worth spelling out the backdrop here. I mean, we're asking about the constraints on the Russian economy towards the end of the third year of the war, because it's turned out that the Russian economy under wartime conditions and under conditions of sanctions has had far more room for growth than we expected, right? There was a hope in 2022 the dramatic impact of the first round of sanctions that were primarily financial would be enough, as it were, to halt the Russian economy in its tracks, to knock it back, such that Putin would be forced to rethink the aggression of his assault, or that perhaps oligarchs would reconfigure within Russia. We've been following the story all along. It's quite sobering to realize that we are towards the end of the third year, and I don't know how many episodes we've done about this question. It's quite a few. And it's been an education, because what we've learned is that the Russian economy has proved remarkably resilient to external sanctioning. In 2023, in the second year of the war, the Russian economy grew by 3.6%. In 2024, it grew by 4.1%. The question we're asking really is it going to hit the buffers now, finally? Right? That's the kind of tone of this question, right? Because what we've seen so far is that the Russians have been able to maintain the momentum. And this has depended on them bypassing the sanctions. And it has also depended on them concentrating the impact of the war tightly within one segment of the economy. The Russian economy is by no means fully mobilized. It's about 10% mobilized, we think. That bit of the Russian economy is running 3 shifts a day continuous. The armaments factories are essentially running round the clock. But that leaves 90% of the Russian economy to benefit from the huge flow of payments that are being generated by the armaments economy and the payments to soldiers, which take the form of recruitment bonuses, death benefits, and disability benefits. And the Russian government, to manage the politics of this, is providing those very, very generously. So this is really a First World War economy. First World, not First World War, but First World War economy they're running. Soldiers get much better off if they join up, right? So this is not a kind of poverty mobilization. And that has produced this really positive, it's called a war Keynesian kind of logic. So is it going to run up against constraints? And you could think of a variety of different constraints. Some of them are financial and fiscal. So we were talking about oil revenues. Those are sharply down. largely driven, I think, by overall price falls. The Russian budget is now set up for oil around $59 a barrel, I think, rather than 70s when the war started. That produces a squeeze. If they break out of that envelope, they have to borrow more. There's the risk of inflation. The Russian central bank is a kind of guarantor of a kind of stability, so it has the tendency to raise interest rates. That produces tensions within the Russian economy. There are supply constraints on that are driven by the limits on investment that are typical during a war. They invested heavily in new armaments capacity, but largely have exploited the full range that they could get out of that. This was largely drones, electronic warfare, ammunition. They've kind of reached the limit there. And then, of course, there's the question of the labor market. I mean, Russia is a really large country with a really large population. So the mobilization by itself is probably not enough to really squeeze the labor market. But running the economy hot, which is what they're doing with unemployment at a very low level, produces labor market strain, gives workers the ability to bargain. People start switching jobs. And there is the brain drain. So they don't have enough highly trained workers. The armaments sector in particular, which employs, roughly 3 million people all told, attrited the hardcore of skilled workers that had grown up in the Soviet Union quite quickly in the 90s and the 2000s. So they don't have the kind of skilled workers that you'd like. Plus, there has been a brain drain out of the Russian economy. All of this adds up to the fact that growth in the first half of 2025 looks really modest. It looks like about 1%. So this would suggest the Russian economy is slowing down and that original burst of growth is unlikely to be able to be sustained. But you have, I think it's really crucial to understand the discursive context this kind of commentary comes out of. We are in a war. The West is heavily engaged on the Ukrainian side. A lot of people have a strongly vested interest in diagnosing the fragility of the Russian economy. They have been proven wrong several times already. And so I think the most reasonable estimation is to say that, yes, there was very likely to be some slowdown in the Russian economy. I wouldn't be counting on any kind of collapse. I wouldn't be counting on any kind of crisis. That's not the situation that we're talking about here. But as it were, growth to limits. And it's quite difficult even before the war, the Russian economy was not exactly a hotbed of innovation and total factor productivity growth. You would expect that to become more and more problematic, especially as the sanctions progressively bite. Don't underestimate, however, their ability to improvise, which they have demonstrated very, very effectively in the first 3 years of this war.
Yeah, it's clear the Russian economy has not collapsed, contrary to some people's expectations. And yeah, Russia is surviving economically and prosecuting this war, but it seems like it's also had to adapt. It's had to change to respond to these new conditions, and perhaps there are distortions that are introduced as well as a result of those adaptations. So I guess I'm curious how that looks applied to a specific sector, namely Russia's defense industry. I mean, how has Russia's defense industry adapted along the way to these sanctions and along the way to the demands of the war itself? Obviously, Russia has traditional defense firms, but at the same time, a kind of new defense economy has arisen in parallel with that, it seems. I've seen references to a new people's military industrial complex in Russia. So how is that relating to the traditional defense firms? And yeah, what could we say overall about Russia's defense industry at this point in the war?
Yeah, it's really a fascinating topic. One I have a slightly weird relationship to, because Russian is the only language into which all of my books have been translated. This is an interest triggered by the work I did on Nazi Germany and the Nazi war economy and the Nazi military-industrial complex. And so people inside the Russian military industrial machine were interested in stories about mobilization. In retrospect, all of that takes on a rather sinister aspect, because I think the easiest way to make sense of the Russian situation, after all, is they have had to adjust. If I am one of the people that doesn't discount the rationality of Putin's actions in launching the war, but on the other hand, still regards it as a profound mistake. And the only way I think one can make sense of it is that they originally assumed that the Ukrainians would collapse. And so as egregious and as risky as this operation was, it was going to succeed because Ukraine was so weak. And facing very serious Ukrainian resistance, and then the West piling in behind Ukraine, the consequence is that Russia, though it perhaps is doing better than we expected, is doing better than we expected not because they had some previous cunning plan, but because they have had to struggle to adjust really quickly. And one element of that is the most dramatic, the one that you see on your screens all the time, is their ability to repurpose Soviet-era Cold War stocks of equipment. That's been a key element of this entire story. They have the capacity not just to newly manufacture, but to repurpose the gigantic stockpiles of heavy ammunition that were stockpiled during the war. And this is where the core function of the heavy military industrial complex is coming into play. They're not producing lots and lots and lots of highly sophisticated new fighter jets. They just don't have the resources all the time. They were set up to produce dozens of those highly sophisticated weapons. What they have managed to do is just produce vast quantities of relatively less dumb bombs, right? By upgrading bombs to be glide bombs, to manufacturing various types of cheap drone, using Iranian templates. So the heavy industrial complex that was inherited from the Soviet Union and modernized in the 2000s and 2010s has proved its mettle. And this is the hardcore that sits around Putin himself and is really organized around Rostec, which is the key player in this zone. The what's been really innovative and fascinating to see is the way in which, analogously to Ukraine and to a degree, I think, in imitation of Ukraine, because Russia has been shocked by Ukraine's resistance because the prior was, we're going to do this quickly, they're going to collapse, Ukraine isn't really a nation, but that whole narrative. Of course, Ukraine has proven that it has remarkable resilience. Ukrainian civil society has rallied around the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, which was also, of course, Soviet legacy, and has produced this entire new generation of drone warfare, electronic warfare equipment, to a degree out of garages. It's like a Silicon Valley type story, right? It's garages, hobbyists. It's a mobilization of civil society, this people's military-industrial complex. And this has been very powerful on the Russian side. I think at this point, we probably have to conclude that really, there are three players in the world that really can do modern land warfare. It's the Israelis, the Ukrainians, and the Russians. And the rest of us are all just watching and trying to take lessons from what they're doing. And the Russians are in that game in large part thanks to this undergrowth. They're undergrowth of very talented, very sophisticated, very energized tech bros, basically, who have the capacity to mobilize and make drone warfare work on the Russian side as well. Because it's an arms race. It's not like the Ukrainians have any kind of stable superiority over the Russians in the development of drone technology. It's highly competitive. So, and then within the Russian political apparatus, it appears that there is a war, kind of a power struggle going on, as you would expect, between the old guard, the true Putin loyalists who are gathered around Rostec, and the new Minister of Defense, who we profiled on the show when he was first inaugurated, because there's this extraordinary background story about his personality, Belosov, who apparently is a champion of the People's Military-Industrial Complex, and he periodically gets, the wave and the endorsement from Putin, who unsurprisingly, encourages Russian society to contribute in a patriotic way. So one shouldn't imagine that the patriotic entrepreneurial mobilization is only a Ukrainian story. It's going on in Russia as well. It fits in the Russian case rather, alongside this powerful Soviet-era military-industrial system, whose biggest contribution, I think, has been its ability just to refurb the vast arsenals that were piled up in the Cold War, and the ones that remain, because much of that was sold off into the global arms market in the 90s. But Russia retained enough of it for it to have been able to fight this war in a way that no one in the West could. We just don't have those stockpiles. So that kind of a possibility is not available.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I do wonder how it'll work out in the medium term, say, because just in terms of political economy, it strikes me that there could be a kind of tension between these traditional firms and this new industrial complex arising, and you could see the war in some sense as maybe Putin intended as sort of asserting the traditional defense firms, their sort of primacy in the country, and then like unintended consequences. You have this kind of rivalrous economy arising alongside it, and I don't know if there will.
I mean, we see that dynamic, don't we, across the board? That was a bit the story of the Wagner Group as well, and it's not surprising that in a war mobilization there is a kind of, there's big army, if you like, and then there's the energized, politicized, radicalized element, which is also part of the war effort, but thinks it's sort of super patriotic and breaking convention and needs to make a revolution. This is, historically, this is where fascism came from in Germany or Italy. It's the Arditi, the stormtroops that become the icons of a militarism that's sort of superlative militarism, and even greater patriotism, and even greater nationalism. And I think that tendency, we see it on the Ukrainian side for sure. And there's no question, I think, that dynamic is unleashed in Russia. And if the story of a kind of Ukrainian, prosperous Ukrainian future based on tech advantage, the kind of Israeli story, is plausible in any way, then I think we have to recognize it works for Russia too. And it certainly works for China, after all, because China has been indirectly supplying all this drone technology that both sides are using as essentially the product of Shenzhen and China's innovative. It's not even sophisticated electronics. It's like just electric motors and batteries. It's making a kind of vertical economy. These were the drones that we thought were going to be delivering Amazon packages, and now they're dropping hand grenades on people.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, I could see how that story could work. Politically, it does strike me as maybe more complicated. I mean, you mentioned the Wagner Group, and we know how that ended, namely with a plane crash with the leader of the Wagner Group dying at Putin's presumptive orders there. I mean, so to be determined, I suppose, how that works out in Russia. But yeah, we should shift to talking about Ukraine because some of this obviously bears on the Ukrainian economy as well. But first, I want to bring up that budget shortfall that I mentioned at the very beginning. That is a $61 billion need in the next 2 years. Specifically in the coming year, for next year, is $18 billion of a budget shortfall that needs to be met. Seems pretty acute crisis for Ukraine potentially. So what are the options right now for filling that gap? Should it be looking into further borrowing? Is that an option for Ukraine?
Yeah, it's very important, I think, to frame this up right, because any suggestion of strategic equivalence between Russia and Ukraine, which might be suggested by battlefield events and so on, is just completely misplaced. Right? Russia is rich, relatively stable, fighting this war with roughly 10% mobilization, isn't really breaking a sweat, you might almost say. Whereas Ukraine is fighting for its life, is absolutely on the edge, hand to mouth, has had a serious, risky, near slide into really rapid inflation moment, desperately dependent on external resources. And this reflects the original position, right, in which the Russian economy was 10 times larger than the Ukrainian economy. So as we move, we sandwich them together in the same episode for obvious reasons, but we should be clear about the difference here. I mean, it's spectacularly different, and Ukraine is incredibly fragile. And I think the economic side of the story is hugely underrated. So I'm always keen to. I'm really glad that you suggested we do it. Yeah, they are desperately short of money. They need tens of billions of dollars or euros. They rely on, the way they do it is that they use their domestic tax flow. It's a kind of political construct, but it also helps. So they get about 63 billion euros worth of domestic taxes. They spend all of that on the war. So that's about 35% of the Ukrainian economy. That's the way they construct this. They hypothecate the tax flow for the war. Then they rely on gifts of armaments, equipment, and so on to feed the war effort. And then essentially the entire rest of the Ukrainian public budget, all of the civilian services necessary to maintain Ukrainian public life, are funded externally by borrowing or domestic borrowing of various types, right? So the structure is essentially we use all of our tax revenue for the war, and everything else we ask our friends to support us with. It's an artificial construction, but it shows the extent of the dependence here. Literally the entire civil part of the Ukrainian government is relying on that flow. And the options really are narrowing, because once upon a time, this was a three-way effort. It was the US, it was Europe, and it was others, notably Japan. And then there's the IMF and the World Bank, which are acting extraordinarily in the middle of this war, despite the fact they have Russian and Chinese shareholders. They are essentially party to the war on Ukraine's side, even though Ukraine has this long-standing track record of failing in IMF programs. All of that was suspended. The IMF and the World Bank backing Ukraine. And the thing that's shifted, of course, is the Trump administration is pulled out. So essentially now the Europeans, because they're the richest, they're the largest, and because their interest is so strong, have, as it were, they're carrying the can. And the issue arises with the force that it does at this current moment, because the Europeans haven't quite figured out how they are going to foot this bill that you're pointing to. And the embarrassment is they had a plan, and they developed this plan over the summer, which was basically to use the reserves of the Russian central bank that were sanctioned in 2022, that are located in Belgium. This turns out to be important. That were sanctioned and immobilized. They're going to use those basically as collateral for a large loan for Ukraine to the tune of about 140 billion euros. So that's $160 billion. So that would cover several years of the necessary margin. And the idea was to use that as the collateral. And then the Belgians woke up with a panic to the realization that if they gave the green light to this, and subsequently there was international litigation, and they were found liable for malfeasance, for essentially handing over assets that were given to them for safekeeping, the Belgians wanted an indemnity from the rest of the EU to the effect that essentially if they were found, that they needed to pay damages. It's like, rule of law within the rule of law within rule of law. We're going to break it and then abide by it. And you'd think the Europeans would say, God damn it, we will not pay compensation. But no, the Belgians are demanding indemnities from their other European partners for the event in which, in a world, they are found to be at fault. And that's collapsed. The Slovakians said no. The Hungarians have never liked this. The Norwegians for a while were saying we might use our sovereign wealth fund. Apparently that idea dissipated. And so now you're back to square one. And so then the Europeans have to solve the European fiscal problem, which which is a long-standing preoccupation of us on this show. And that could take the form of individual grants from member states. It could take the form of a joint EU loan, or you might be able to somehow front load funding that other members of the G7 had committed to and pay that out quickly. The timing here is significant because you want to get through to 2028, because in 2028, in the already agreed European budget, there's 100 billion provided for Ukraine. And so the Europeans are trying to find ways of just doing 6, 7, and then once they get to 8, they've already agreed a political frame. It's, like I say, it's compared to the relative stability of the Russian war funding, even under this intensive sanctioning, the Ukrainian financing regime just looks incredibly precarious. And they had thought they had resolved that. Well, they had under Biden. But with the Trump administration in place and the American Congress in the kind of mood it is, really it's down to the Europeans. And the Europeans have demonstrated again this year that they simply don't have the coherence on this issue that they would like. They may get there in the end. Apparently, Kyiv's sanguine that in the end they're too big to fail. The Europeans will pull themselves together. But it must be, from the point of view of the Ukrainian political system, this is terrifying stuff.
Yeah, it does seem to put paid to Europe's claims of wanting to support Ukraine at any expense. It seems like finding the actual money is harder going for European countries in practice. But yeah, the questions that we were talking about in terms of Russia's defense industry and its role in Russia's economy, I'm curious how we could sort of raise the same questions about Ukraine. I mean, in a general sense, how militarized at this point is the Ukrainian economy? I mean, we talk about it as a kind of member of the West, as a kind of would-be European country, a candidate country for the European Union. But if we were to look at the structure of its economy at this point, how similar is it in that sense to other European countries? I mean, what portion of its growth comes from military-related activity? And what does that suggest about Ukraine? What does that portend for Ukraine's future going forward?
Well, Ukraine is in a state of war economy. This is, it's we think military spending is running at about 35% of GDP. So that's 3 times more than Russia. Russia's 10% level is like US during the Vietnam War. 30% is like the US early in World War II. Towards the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany got up to 60%, which means basically if you're not in the war economy, you don't eat. You're really squeezing the economy down to its essentials. The UK ran World War II on 45 to 50% of GDP. So Ukraine isn't at a World War II level of mobilization, but for a modern society, this is extraordinary. That's like the entirety of all public services in the United States taken out and devoted to war. So that's roughly the government share in the US. So imagine local government, federal government, the whole works, all of it devoted to the war effort. That just completely, every school, every police car, everything is all soldiering. So it totally warps the economy. And it's not even greater because the Ukrainians are really balancing multiple different constraints. The most fundamental one, which is often in the news, is recruitment. This is a war being fought essentially by middle-aged guys. It's very, very unlike most modern wars, which obviously try and recruit principally young men who are the prime fighting material for infantry warfare. You try and recruit people in their early 20s, whereas the Ukrainians, the average age of the frontline soldiers is 40 or more, right? So they have deliberately spared the cohort of young people. This limits the amount of manpower they have in the front line. The entire military effort sort of shuffles back from there. I've seen reports that say that the fabled drone sector, which is obviously an absolutely key element of this war, it's like World War I trench warfare with drones and robots, essentially, is only 40% utilized because the Ukrainians don't have the cash to fully mobilize their potential. It's a multiply constrained. The threat is existential. The commitment is to a degree total because Ukraine really is fighting for its survival. And yet, even then, it's a very, very powerful demonstration of the fact that total war economies are never really quite total because it's limited on the supply side. There is also by labor. It's also limited by political constraints, which mean that they don't really want to hard ration things. So they use a price mechanism. But even as they are struggling with, repeated Russian attacks on the electricity infrastructure, electricity is scarce. An economist would tell you, you either ration or you increase prices. And so there are like Western teams of economists saying, whenever the Russians mount a cruise missile strike on one of your generators, you know what? People's electricity rates should go up because then they will consume less power. It's surreal, right? As a conversation. And then unsurprisingly, the Ukrainians shrug and go, you've got to be kidding. No, we're not going to do that anytime soon. So the consequence is they then have excess demand for electricity because people aren't cutting back because they're essentially rationing by blackout rather than a sustained World War II style rationing system because it's not obvious how you run. Ukraine was essentially in many respects a modern society. How on earth do you turn that into a World War II system? The sort of one that my parents lived through where people, working class Europeans didn't take cars for granted or electricity for granted or indoor toilets for granted. That wasn't the thing. So when you rationed, knowing you were going to get X amount of sugar every week was maybe even an improvement on not knowing whether you were going to get that much sugar every week, right? So that isn't Ukraine's situation. And then of course on top of that, there is the huge issue of not just recruitment of young men, but of refugees, right? So millions and millions of people if you go anywhere and you're in Berlin, you know this only too well. There's a huge expat population of Ukrainians now, including many, many young families, principally single mother-headed families because the men are in Ukraine, but with children growing up now over 3 years of the war, essentially more and more embedded in the places they've moved to, which in many cases have higher incomes. And if this war was about attaching Ukraine to Europe, for those refugees, they've achieved the goal of attaching themselves as Ukrainians to Europe, right? That's the reality they're living, obviously under traumatic circumstances and with terror for those that are left behind. But the question then for the future of Ukraine is how you leverage that in a productive way. Can you bring people back to Ukraine? Do you have a remittance flow? Do you get West European investment to Ukraine and then move people who've had experience in working in German factories and offices to Ukraine to work in facilities there? There were all these options being canvassed. But the immediate reality is that the front line is really, really brittle right now. The Ukrainian troops are fighting really for survival to avoid encirclement, and the attritional pressure from Russia is relentless. The winter is coming. The electricity supply system is very vulnerable. And so there's whereas with Russia, one can carry on a conversation about the logic of the Russian economy over a longer period of time. With Ukraine, the real question is what happened? Can they get through to the next year? And what does it look like? And what are the terms under which they might be forced to agree an end to the fighting? Let's not call it a peace.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say these were not the terms under which Ukraine was imagining integrating with Europe, namely by sort of exporting its population in this way to the rest of the continent, and de facto having those kinds of links under this kind of wartime circumstances. Yeah, more generally, it does seem like there are general questions raised about dealing with conditions of scarcity in Western countries. Because the way you described the war situation in Ukraine reminds me of the would-be energy crisis in Europe, at the beginning of the war, and there was all sorts of rhetoric about like cutting usage and using less energy, but at the same time, Germany, paired that rhetoric with subsidies of energy use, and so there was a kind of internal contradiction there that never kind of got resolved. But I did also want to ask about the relationship between this war economy, as you've been describing it in Ukraine, and this corruption problem that I mentioned at the outset of our discussion. As I mentioned, this new reporting shows that corruption seems to be kind of endemic in the Ukrainian government, up to and potentially including the circles around President Zelensky. And as I said, I'm curious about the relationship between corruption and war. And, is state corruption an kind of constant threat if you're fighting an all-out war? If we're disrupting normal economic activity, and is corruption a kind of wartime corollary of that kind of footing?
I mean, I think that's fair, and you could say is corruption, an endemic problem of military procurement in general. After all, think about the endless stories of gouging and excess profit taking within the American military-industrial complex, as Bert Brecht once remarked. What's robbing a bank compared to running a bank? The logic here, I think, is it's much better to think of this not in moralistic terms, but in functional terms, in distributional terms. How is it that the benefits and profits, the surplus value that can be creamed off at different points in production and distribution, inside and outside the state, how's it distributed at any given time? And to take up your point also of emergency and its effect on this, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to point to a moment in which the Ukrainian economy has been in a state of normality since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Right? I mean, it has basically struggled from crisis to crisis. There's been periods of rebuilding. There's been more positive directions of change, but it has been a sort of a series of moments of really high drama, and in that. There was always, an underlay of oligarchic corruption on a really large scale, truly kleptocratic large scale. When the Europeans famously came to Kyiv in 2013 with their offer of a couple of hundred million euros as a way of leveraging Yanukovych's then government, into a privileged relationship with the EU, the local oligarchs sniffed at it and said, that's not the kind of bribe I'm used to. I talk real money, and the EU's budget was not large enough to really get in the game, which is why Putin was able to swing things in 2013. September 21, when Zelensky was fresh in office and before the crisis exploded, there was a hugely embarrassing scandal around corruption already building in Ukraine at that point. And I think I say all of this by way of preface because the allegation of corruption against Ukraine was so comprehensive, and essentially slid into the diagnosis of Ukraine as a failed state, which was very widely shared and which fed into then our assumption that it would collapse. And this was an assumption shared by the Americans, by the Russians, by many of the Ukrainians themselves at the beginning of the war. And it has proven to be false. Right. So whatever level of corruption there is in Ukraine, it has not been as corrosive of state capacity as we imagined. That is, I think, the baseline for all discussions of Ukrainian corruption. And I think the smart analysis at this point now in 2025, they are still managing to fight a war we would struggle to fight, right? We can't account for the money we've given them. Like, they can't account for it either, but like, we can't account for it. The American funding agencies don't know where their money went because they didn't keep track in Ukraine because it's in a war situation. So it's tumultuous, it's hard to track, it's easy to move money around. And I think the smart analysis early on, which I was very convinced by, because I was certainly amongst those who, on the basis of GDP numbers and others, underestimated Ukraine's resilience, is that what had happened after 2014 is not that corruption had gone away and they cleaned themselves up, but that, and the manner of state building also in Europe in the 18th and 19th century, or in the New York City in the late 19th century, the corrupt machinery had been moved inside the state apparatus and was now pulling in the same direction of Kyiv and against Russia, right? And that actually helped to explain the resilience of many provinces, many of the regions in the east of Ukraine, when faced with the Russian onslaught, is that all of a sudden the local, if you like, oligarchs, the local gentry, lined up in their support of Kyiv, mobilized their networks to resist the Russian invasion because they had found a new modus vivendi in which Kyiv was much more commanding, but had not stamped out corruption. And in a sense, I think what we're seeing now is apolitical fighting inside Kyiv, with Zelensky struggling but failing to contain the entrepreneurial energy of NABU, which is the anti-corruption agency, which is a little bit like the clean hands Italian magistrates of the early 90s. This is a group of people that are really zealously trying to clean up the Ukrainian state and fighting the good fight for clean government. And they are a loose cannon on the deck of a oligarchically organized war machine like this. And Zelensky tried to shut them down in the summer, faced a huge outrage and failed. And so now they're beginning to unpick networks of corruption, which in the atomic power case, I think, go back decades. The first person accused of being a ringmaster of this scheme apparently fled into exile in Russia in 2022. So this isn't a new thing. It's not a Zelensky era thing. These are this malappropriations of money that were supposed to be flowing into the maintenance of the nuclear system. What is, I think, more really egregious is the fact that it's quite clear that money that was intended to fortify the electricity system against Russian attack, they were supposed to be building bunkers around the generators, which when they're knocked out, leave large parts of Ukraine in the dark. Those bunkers weren't being built, and that money was being siphoned off. There's been instances where helmets have been overpriced by a factor of 4 or 5. Not something else that's unfamiliar to the Pentagon, but it's a scandal, obviously, in a war when people's heads are being blown off if you can't provide them with affordable helmets, where body armor is not being priced properly, and so on and so forth. So there's a long-standing story. There's a flux of kind of politics around this question in Ukraine. There's no question at all that Ukraine, I would read this not as a sort of something structurally is new. There's always been this pressure in Ukraine, this tension in Ukraine. The question is how it's managed at any given moment. And I think the fact that Zelensky was not able to keep this under wraps and that it's exploded is a sign of just how much pressure he's under, from the front line, from Washington, from this outstanding issue of funding from Europe, and from domestic political pressure. It's really a night. I mean, it's politics of near total war. It's very dramatic in the pressure that it exercises on the key actors.
Yeah, I mean, as a general point, it is a fascinating idea to consider that corruption is not a contradiction or doesn't necessarily contradict state capacity, but it could even, could be a sign of growing state capacity, in the sense that a rising tide lifts all boats, including the corrupt in the state, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, it's an opprobrious way. It's a legalistic, opprobrious, moralistic way of talking about political economy. and should be understood as such, right?
Yeah, I mean, what it certainly seems to me is to complicate again, I guess, its relationship with Europe, where these are like the kind of moralistic terms about talking about democracy and political economy are very much sort of baked into the liberal terms of the European Union. But
at least on paper. But then if you ask that question about the reality of Germany's political economy, you're opening a can of worms, right? And the Germans actually know it. So it's and I don't want to create false equivalences between the really large scale multi-billion euro kleptocracy that has at various times blighted Ukraine's history. There's degrees, that's part of the argument. But the story is precisely one that's quite dynamic and fluid. And the really interesting thing is that somehow the politics of corruption have exploded in the way they have in Ukraine. There's always a politics of corruption there. It's like, why has it suddenly become the issue that it has as this moment?
Well, I think for this particular moment, we should probably end the conversation. But, Ukraine and Russia are going to be continuing fighting, which means we will continue following what happens there. But for now, we should say goodbye. We'll be back, as always, next week with new data points.